We know, I'm being tongue-in-cheek here. It's Friday afternoon. I'm told that we've kept you awake so far. We're going to try and keep that up. And I've been advised that it would be a good thing to, if somebody wants to jump up and have a question or a comment that's relevant to what we're talking about. I'm not suggesting you jump up, but you might want to raise your hand and I'll call on you. How about that?
Bob especially, you don't want standing up.
Sorry?
You don't want Bob standing up especially.
No, no. Bob, don't stand up. Bob told us he has the capability of working in his underwear. We don't know that he is. So, well, I promised we'd talk about the internal responsibility system. And we're going to do that in a minute. But before we do, given what I just said, is there a comment on the first half? And do we have Kimberly with a microphone rushing over? And we do.
My question is, and thanks to the panel, I think this is such great information. I think we need to do this more often. We need to get it out to our members. This information is invaluable, and where we're heading in the next decade, it's so important to start lobbying and start pushing together and try to make some changes. Just real quick, my question with diesel emissions. I work in the mines. I'm the Joint Health and Safety Coordinator for Mine Mill 598 Unifor. And I was just wondering the value, you talk about information, and it's through the peer information, registering with WSIB, that you've been exposed to a carcinogen or whatever. So for diesel emissions, should every miner, coast to coast to coast, actually fill out that form and send it in to WSIB? Just a question, is that valuable information to send out and register?
With the assumption that they've been exposed to a carcinogen.
Well,
Just have
every
everybody,
single miner,
maybe that's the answer to overcoming the focus.
in my opinion right now, it's saying every miner that's worked underground with diesel equipment has been exposed. I don't know, I'm not fishing, I hope, but I'm saying that we all have been exposed.
JP wants to tackle that.
I personally think that's brilliant. Because if someone was to be exposed to asbestos, absolutely, we wouldn't think twice. We wouldn't. We fill it out in an exposure form, I think you're making reference to, the WSIB exposure form. So we fill that out. Absolutely, I think that's a great strategy because, well, one of the questions that you're going to pose, and I'm going to burst your bubble now. So one of the question was, you know, are we putting profit before people? The question is yes when it comes to diesel exhaust. So the ICGI, ACGHI.
ACGIH?
Thank you.
ACGI.
It's the governance body for TLVs, for example. They're proposing that diesel particulates be at a maximum 0.25. The employers and the mining community is saying we can't live with that. We can live 1.6. So right now there's a battle happening right now, and Janice kind of touched on it. Peterborough was something of the past, and the rubber workers are something. We're living it today. We're living it today where the employer is saying we can't meet this demand. We want 1.6. Now, if the government accepts that, I could bet you $100 when I go to a tribunal and argue diesel exhaust, and they're going to say, well, this worker was exposed to 1.5 milligrams per cubic meter. He's under the TLV. It can't be work-related. That's bullshit. That really is. That is a brilliant recommendation, and I'm telling you now, I'm bringing it back to the hall. That's smart, and I love it. Thank you very much
I'll
for that
help you
comment.
fill out the forms.
No, but I challenge everybody to do this. Yep. Now, if there's no other speaker, I got one more. And this comes from Mark. I just finished in Sudbury, unfortunately. We had a double fatality at First Nickel Mines, and I was with the Methey and the Bissayon family all the way through this. And when I look at the fact of a company bankrupt and walk away from all responsibilities, and whether it's happened and could happen through exposures that once a company has dissolved and bankrupt, is there a way of challenging and pushing legislation, especially through the Bankruptcy Act? It's criminal how this happened, and we need to, as far as I'm concerned, if you've been charged criminally, you cannot be discharged from bankruptcy. I'm just wondering if anybody had a comment from that.
I'd love to weigh in if I don't want to hog this thing. So first of all, our condolences to your members. I think it's horrible that you have to go through a coroner's inquest to influence change. But to answer your question, I don't think it's just for fines that are levied against companies for violating the Occupational Safety Act. We've seen the same thing for Sears, for example, where they're saying we can't even fund our pension fund. So workers are bearing the blunt, the negative effects of companies going bankrupt. All of the money is filtering up to the CEOs, and they're still getting bonuses for some cases. They're still getting their bonuses, but at the end, we really have nothing for the workers. So I think the legislation is exactly that. How do we protect workers when companies go insolvent or bankrupt? There's got to be something there to protect workers, much bigger than just health and safety, though. Yeah.
Well, with car insurance, they have the fund facility, I think it is. So basically, if you're a high-risk driver, you have to go into facility, which is a fund where you have to pay higher rates and stuff like that because of things. You know, with the nuclear waste management, you know, if you have a nuclear plant, you have to put money into this fund to figure out what to do with the spent fuel rods because they last for 250 million years, the radioactivity of them. And that's why the Nuclear Waste Management Organization is, you know, going to all these communities and cause they have the money to do it because they have like billions in this fund that the employers have put into. So why don't you do the same thing? So that if a company goes bankrupt or whatever, if you get hit by a car and the other guy doesn't have insurance, we have this scheme to fund you to make sure that, you know, that guy didn't have insurance and now it's on you. No, you have some sort of so the employers pay into another fund that that funds if, you know, there's 100 employers and 10 of them are gone and you happen to be hurt by the 1 in 10 who are gone, then the rest of them ensure that you're paid. So that would be one
Thank you.
suggestion.
There's a question over here. Thank you for that question and for the wonderful activist suggestion that I hope everybody will take back with them.
So we have a comment online that says, many members do not have FMDs and depend on walk-in clinics and ERs. Then medical and accident history is so limited, language barriers exist, and many doctors or clinics are annoyed with dealing with WSIB. And then she continues, as a workers' rep, I struggle to refer to WSIB as a compensation system and not an insurance system, which changes the narrative.
It is an insurance system. They call themselves an insurance system. In the WSIB documents, Freedom of Information documents, that's how they present themselves. They are no longer, when they change things over, they're not looking to compensate, even though we gave up our right to sue. So if they change their mind, we can change ours. We can start suing them. That's how I look at it.
It's true, workers' compensation legislation was passed in, what, 1913? I'm sure there's a room full of people who know this. And it was done in order to stop the growing number of court cases, right? I mean, they've changed their name and their role.
That's correct. So back and I think it was adopted into law in 1915, April 28th, which happens to be your day of mourning, and that's not by coincidence. So Sir Meredith, which is really the godfather and the person that initiated the principles of the WSIB, or the Workmen's Compensation Board of the day, was conservative. He was mandated by the Conservatives to deal with that because there was pressure from the employer community to say, we can't run our businesses if we're going to be sued. We need a system in place so we could project our costs. That's what we want, a safe business environment. So in reality, the WSIB is an employer scheme. It is. It was made to protect the employers. And at first it was paying out, and Mr. Chesney was showing some numbers where there was some half-decent compensations, you know, in the 85 era where people were actually compensated for their impairments for the rest of their days. That dwindled. Now we give crumbs. But I think we're on the verge where what needs to happen is the workers need to take over that system. It can't be owned and managed and put in place for the employers. I think the workers have to get together and say, this belongs to us. This is for us, and by the way, employers, you're going to pay. So I think there's got to be a change in that. So it's a deep question. It really is a tough.
Any others from the floor? We're going to break for Q&A before we end the session, before 3 o'clock. So let me hustle right into this. Bob, this is for you and Steve and JP as well. And let me start. You all know this already, but I'm going to begin with a description. In 1979, the Occupational Health and Safety Act finally came to existence in Ontario. Among other things, the Act granted workers 3 rights related to occupational health and safety and unsafe working conditions. 1, the right to know about hazards. 2, the right to participate with the employer to remedy hazards. And 3, the right to refuse unsafe work. These form a key part of the Internal Responsibility System, the IRS. And if you're on the webinar and you're watching from the US, it is not the Internal Revenue Service, just it's the Internal Responsibility System. So here's my question, Bob. The basic assumption of the Internal Responsibility System, IRS, that employers and workers somehow share an interest in safer workplaces, that basic assumption might overlook some of the power dynamics in the workplace, like the potential for workers to be disciplined, penalized, or even terminated for invoking any part of the IRS, in particular the right to refuse unsafe work. Is there a possibility that the underlying principles of the Internal Responsibility System, that the 2 parties share the same interest, is at least sometimes incorrect? And does this help to explain the shortcomings of the IRS and the need for workers in joint committees to understand the technical and political limitations of the IRS?
Yeah, I think assuming that workers and employers share an interest in safer workplaces is mostly pretty naive. Shared interests in capitalist workplaces stop as soon as the question of who should benefit from the surplus value of labor come up. Workers want it in the form of wages and safer and better working conditions, and employers want it in the form of profit. And since employers are typically more powerful, employers tend to get their way. We know that workers and employers don't share much of an interest in safer workplaces because before there were laws, employers routinely traded our lives for their profit. You need to only go back to the 1960s and 70s in Ontario to see that writ very clearly. And that's why workers wanted government operated injury prevention laws. So finally the political pressure gets to be too much for the government of the day, and they enact an injury prevention system based on the IRS. Or put another way, the government enacted an injury prevention system that relies on employers acting contrary to their own economic interests, which is basically cheaping out on safety. Now, in theory, there are checks on the employer's behavior in the IRS system, right? The government is an external check. It's supposed to inspect a workplace and impose penalties when there are violations. In practices, governments almost never inspect a workplace. The inspection cycle in Alberta here is between once every 25 and once every 50 years for a workplace. And there's very few meaningful penalties. So there's really no risk of an employer getting caught breaking the rules. And if they do get caught, there's really no risk of a meaningful penalty. The other check, as you pointed out in your question, are the three rights to know and participate and refuse. And the right to refuse is often touted as some sort of panacea for all of the weaknesses and problems we see in the IRS and more broadly in health and safety laws, because in the end, a worker can always refuse. But that ignores how power actually works in the workplace. If I exercise my right to refuse, my boss is going to be really pissed off at me. I don't think my boss is going to be stupid enough to fire me, but there's going to be consequences, right? I'm not going to get overtime. I'm going to get a bad shift or a bad job. There'll be discipline for trifling offenses. Maybe I'm the first to go when layoffs come around. And workers, we're not stupid. We understand how the system actually works. So what happens when we face unsafe work because the employer hasn't lived up to their part of the bargain to control the hazard is we start bargaining against ourselves, right? We ask ourselves, like, how unsafe is it? Like, is it really unsafe? Do I want to refuse? Or is there some way I could make it a little less unsafe? Maybe if I just do it real quick, or I use a long stick, or I hold my breath, right? Those are the kinds of trade-offs that workers participate in, because we're really looking at, is it really worth the risk of actually exercising our right? And most of the time, the answer is no. And I don't want to demonize all employers, right? Because sometimes employers do the right thing. But is that because the system works, or is it because the employer maybe has a personal belief or a personal relationship with the workers, or in fact shares the exposure that the workers are having? Or sometimes it's cheap enough that it's okay for the employer to prevent the hazard, right? It's cheaper to prevent the hazard than just let the worker experience it. But overall, to wrap up my answer, like, we have an injury prevention system that hopes employers will do the right thing, even though what is morally the right thing is in fact not in an employer's economic interest. And the evidence is overwhelmingly that employers don't do the right thing when they're given that choice. So that doesn't sound like a very effective system to me, because it isn't one.
Thank you. JP?
Well, the fireworks are going to start, I guess, that you want. I respectfully disagree on a number of things. And part of the reason is my very narrow-minded view, and I'm a very privileged white male in a male-dominated industry that is unionized. So please take this as at face value. So in the 70s, we had a wildcat strike in Elliott Lake that started the Ham Commission. And I bet you there'd be a ton of steelworkers rolling in their graves now, or some old steelworkers in Elliott Lake saying, I disagree, and I have to talk on their behalf, right? The deaths, the fatalities, and the Yacht disease in Elliott Lake was overwhelming, where workers actually stopped work, got out of their comfort zone, and said, we're not doing this anymore. They had the passion to stand up for their rights, but also they had to be pushed into an area where they were no longer comfortable. That's why there was a wildcat strike. The result of that, part of it, was the Green Book, which is the IRS system. So from my perspective, if you look into where we were, and in my intro, my ancestors were all in mining. My father, for example, worked half his career with no legislation. The IRS is not a great system. It is working for unionized environments. For one, because it takes away the fear of reprisal, but in most part, not to say that some of our workers that exercise their right to refuse don't get penalized. They do. Let's not be naive about that. But the right to know, for example, and the right to participate is given to our health and safety committees. Before 1978, on average, we were killing 6 to 12 people a year. After that, it slowly went down, where the last 12 years, we've lost 4 people, and I'm talking about workplace fatalities. The numbers that Paul put up with cancer cases, you saw the drop shortly after the implementation of the Act. So where the workers in Elliott Lake, where they said that's enough, and the Ham Commission went around, well, their demand was to have some type of balance, and the balance in labor's view was the IRS. It seemed to appease. Again, from my perspective, when we talk about precarious workers, When we talk about immigrants, when we talk about non-unionized people, absolutely. Absolutely, they're not as privileged. And I say that, again, with respect. So is the issue the IRS? Or is the issue we need to organize people that are less fortunate? I don't know. I'm throwing that out as a conversation piece.
Steve?
Maybe just to bridge the two, because in the end, I don't think you're disagreeing in many respects. And I think one of the things that we need to think about is the overall fact that when you have employers, employees, and the state or regulators as part of this overall system of regulation, you have increasingly powerful corporations, increasingly weak labor that's in increasingly precarious work, increasingly low-paying work, where people are having, even people in well-paying jobs are having a hard time meeting their living standards. And you have a state or a regulator that's woefully under-resourced, woefully, the laws are not adequate, then you basically have a system of self-regulation, a de facto system of self-regulation. And so I think that broader context, we need to think about that, right? Because the union, as you know, the rates of unionization are lower. Those who have that ability to collectively organize is increasingly rare. I mean, it does speak to the importance of how unions, the research is clear that union workshops are the safest workshops, and it's because there's that ability to collectively allow workers to realize the rights that they have. But when you have this IRS on paper versus the IRS in this broader context of what's going on with the economy and labor relations generally, I think that's where we see the real problems emerging.
I'm looking for an article. This comes from UCOM blog. And this is dated December 4th, 2019. And the headline is Union Construction Jobs Safer Than Non-Union. A new study shows non-union job sites have 3 times more fatalities. And I guess we can post that on the OCOW site, along with a couple of other references. Sticking with, and I agree, Steve, I don't see a disagreement, but the IRS, as developed by HAM, and by the way, the 44th anniversary of the HAM Commission report is coming up. We need to do something for the 50th, but we can do a dry run sometime, maybe at the 45th. Yes, as JP suggested, it was a response to the disaster at Elliott Lake, and given the conditions, the current economic conditions, especially the post-2008 crash, precarious work, all the things that you've mentioned, and you know, which are vastly different than 1976, does HAM's vision of IRS still apply, or should we look for an alternative? Should we, and if we were to beef it up, how would we beef it up? I don't think anybody's suggesting we get rid of it. I think we're suggesting that we give it some teeth. For one, the right to refuse is underutilized. Eli wants to say something here, but Eli, you need a mic so the folks.
Thrown out of better places, you know. But I couldn't get the floor. Let me tell you let me just go back to the bill for a moment, because I was in Elliott Lake during that time that led to the HAM. The legislation wasn't even printed. The ink wasn't dry, and management started to oppose in every conceivable way every attempt at bringing in health and safety legislation. And the real guilty party in the IRS, although I opposed it all the time I was at Queen's Park, is the government's what the government has done, and the government of every province has done, is keep themselves out of any responsibility. I thought the Ministry of Labor was to protect labor and to bring in labor legislation. Well, what the hell are they doing? They went to the internal responsibility system and never raised a finger to make it work, because a committee I led across Ontario twice, indicated that in every community, the real problem was the internal responsibility system by all of the unions. No objection. We tried to get the government to start to accept its responsibility as the government and the people responsible for labor. And we seem to forget there's something called a government, and we've got right across Canada. Every province has given away the right to protect workers by sharing. And they've left it now totally to management. And I'm afraid the unions are going to have to wake up to that reality. Now, it's really a battle of unions. There are some who've done some magnificent work. Others, pretty iffy. But if we don't, and this should be a time that unions are really organizing because they're getting the shit kicked out of them so often. And started to raise hell about what's going on at the compensation board, which was a disgrace, and what's going on in the workplace. And as they cover their ass with phony figures on how many workers are killed or dying from the workplace. And again, it's like everything else. The government of the day keeps backing away, keeping itself free. They are responsible. And it's time we woke up to that reality. And that's when we had the most pressure on them, is when the unions were really involved. And the internal responsibility system could work in a moment if the government said, all right, you two guys are responsible. Labor here, management there. And if you don't behave, we, the government, will impose something on you each and every time if they wanted to do it. They couldn't care how many workers we take to the bone orchard. They don't give a damn. It's as simple as that. And when you start to realize that, and Peterborough is probably the worst example now going on what's happened there. And I was in with my committee twice into Peterborough many years ago. And it's a disgrace what's going on there. But the internal responsibility system could work if the government said it's going to work as we put in our brochure, the Ministry of Labor brochure, and we're going to be responsible for making sure it works. I mean, they are the government. They get paid for doing it.
Bob, I happen to know that in 2010 you wrote something about occupational health and safety being the one area where government actually takes itself out of the picture and leaves enforcement alone to the two other parties, employers and employees. Do you want to speak to that? Because I think that's the crux of Eli's point.
Yeah, I don't actually recall writing that, but that doesn't mean I didn't. It was a long time ago.
I read your book more recently than you did, I think.
Fair enough. I mean, it seems to me there is always a power imbalance in workplaces and in the economy more broadly between capital and labor, right? The rich and the rest of us who have to work. And the IRS is premised upon both of those parties coming in and doing their best in good faith to make the workplace safe. And if that doesn't happen, right, the framers of the IRS knew that that was possible, then the government would act as an external regulator. But the fact is, the government doesn't act as an external regulator. It simply throws up its hands. My own workplace might be an example. We have a quarterly inspection requirement. We never meet that inspection requirement. We can't motivate the employer to do that. When we complain to the government simply does nothing. They don't even issue an order. That is not an uncommon experience in Alberta, and I don't believe it's uncommon elsewhere. The government has simply abandoned its role, because why would it want to get politically in the middle of this when it can simply deal it off to workers and employers?
Steve, can you think of any other regime where the state takes itself out of the picture and lets the parties at hand battle it out with each other?
No, I'm not sure I could add much more than what Bob said. I think
Yeah.
he's right on that. No, I don't.
And at the heart of James Ham's IRS is this notion of consensus theory, that we come together in the workplace because there's a shared interest. And what employers bring is investment, capital in an enterprise, and what employees contribute is their labor and their health and their lives. And somehow that's the balance. There's the consensus. So at the heart of it, consensus theory is severely flawed. Do we have a substitute for IRS?
That question was debated back in the early, I want to say 2012, 2013. We had a mining review. As you're aware, we had a rash of fatalities. The families got behind the unions. We had a great campaign. The unions were pushing for an inquiry, basically saying the legislations are 40 years old. It's time to revisit them. So the government of the day said, okay, we're going to do an inquiry. The mining inquiry set up 12 subcommittees to look at different aspects of the mine. One subcommittee was designated to the IRS. It was the only committee that came back with no recommendations. None. So the obvious response or belief is, right now we can't think of a better system. And you're right, there's room for improvements, but that was tasked. That was specifically tasked from a subgroup. And there was nothing there to replace it yet. I don't know.
They
the
thought
answer.
IRS was beautiful?
I didn't say that was beautiful.
I'm not, but
Yeah.
the subcommittee believes
The
that
subcommittee says
it
we
couldn't be
we
improved.
can't think of anything else, or there's nothing else that
Wow.
that we could replace this at this point in time. The only committee out of the 12. So I don't have the answers. The power imbalance is there. It's real. I don't know if we have the answer when we had a panel looking at that. I don't know if we could solve that problem here, but it's definitely worth kicking the conversation to start that and to have people think about that.
I also think long-term, but I think there's a conversation to be had about changing the nature of workplaces. And a lot of people in the field that I work in make recommendations around having more workers on boards of companies, better worker representation. Or how about having conversations about worker-led workplaces, worker-owned workplaces, cooperatives? After all, when we're talking about the dynamics of workplace safety, it's the decisions made around how workplaces are organized that lead to these kinds of serious injury and death. So beyond the IRS, I think there are some serious questions to ask about what are the roles that workers have in making decisions about how they organize their workplaces. And that entails having those broader conversations about worker-led initiatives, worker-led boards, or worker representation on boards, and even worker cooperatives.
Europe, Northern Europe, has worker councils. Germany tried to introduce that in the southern US, and Volkswagen workers, despite the fact that Volkswagen's parent company wanted to go along with worker councils, workers said no to a union, which would have put them on a seat at a workers' and employers' council. Let's shift a bit to both fines and incentives for not reporting. In Ontario, let's start here. In Ontario, we've seen some comparatively small fines levied against employers for workplace fatalities as a result of violations of the Act. And you know what? I brought some examples. Construction company fined $90,000 for senior's death at Toronto condo site. And that's from 2018. Here's one, July 2018, worker's death results in $100,000 fine for Campbellford Company. Sudbury Company fined $50,000 in workplace injury. Stony Creek plant fined $150,000 in workplace death. I could go on, but I get these regularly mailed to me by the Ministry of Labor. So are fines, given this context, an effective deterrent? to the policing of workplace fatalities and accidents under the Act? Or are there studies on the impact of fatality-related fines as a deterrent? And if so, what do they tell us? Steve, I'm going to toss this to you.
Sure. The short answer is no, they're not effective. I do an exercise, I teach a third-year course in corporate crime, and I do an exercise with my students every year where I put up examples of somewhat like you just did, fines that companies receive for a work-related fatality. Issue number one is most often these fines are for OHS offenses, right? And when you look at the wording of that offense, companies are not held responsible for killing somebody. They're fined for failure to provide proper safety training, some kind of benign way of describing a very serious act. So that's problem number one in my mind. But on the specific topic of fines, fines are a cost of doing business, period. And those fines are passed on to either the consumer, who ends up paying more money for that good or service that that company provides so they can recoup the cost of that fine, or worse, the costs of that fine are passed on to workers who are forced to work under even more restrictive, less safe working conditions as that company tries to, again, regain the profits that they lost through that fine. There is a concept called an equity fine, right? And an equity fine would be a fine in which a company might have to, as a penalty, reissue some shares in its company to workers themselves, to the community affected by the incident, or that they might have to direct some of that fine money directly to the victim or the families. Maybe in those circumstances we could see some benefit to fines. Otherwise, fines are largely, in my mind, and through the research that I look at, is largely a cost of doing business. If we're really truly serious about holding companies accountable, and again, as I've already said, so I won't reiterate it too much, holding those individuals within the company responsible that make the decisions around these things, that would be a different order of conversation. But right now, it gives the illusion that the government is doing something when sometimes people see the amounts of these fines, sometimes they can be quite high, and it gives the illusion of it, but to a big corporation, it's a drop in the bucket. And in terms of deterrence and changing workplace cultures, there's little evidence to show that it achieves anything.
JP?
It's a cheap way of doing business. And I'll give you an example. It's $8 to park here. And I bet you half the people didn't pay the $8 because it's a $10 parking fine. The $10 is not going to turn people. It's relatively, the 50,000, 150,000, Valley was charged $1 million. That's like having a $2 bill in your pocket. It really is a very cheap way of doing business. So to say that that's going to deter any company is false. The other thing, the company is faceless. It's just something you see at the stock exchange. And to go to your point, the way to really deter is you put that manager in jail. Mm-hmm. So when that manager's in jail, this manager running this company is going to say, damn, I better straighten up because I'm next. Or that manager, that's the way when you start putting a face to those responsible, and not this faceless identity, which we call corporations, but Mr. ABC that runs that business, you put him in jail, now you're going to start to see everybody else come into line. So I think that would be the biggest deterrent.
And take the money personally out of those managers' personal accounts. You know what I mean? It's very different if you know, I have, my company's going to pay for something that I did, my negligence, whoops, my bad. Very different if I'm the one that has to pay for that.
What about the other end of fines, thinking of the cost of doing business? What do we do about incentives for not reporting a workplace injury? So I'm talking monetary awards. I'm talking, of course, there are signs, 0 days since we've had an accident. Pizzas, jackets, boats, trips. Employers find that that's the cost of doing business. And it's an incentive to workers not to report a workplace accident or injury. And I see a lot of heads nodding, so you all know this happens. Does somebody on the floor want to tell us how it happens at their workplace? Yeah?
At our workplace, emissions be phased out, which is a good thing because it was materially not from reporting.
Yeah, so it was phased out?
Yeah, so it's phased out, but in regards to the fines and cost of business, the way I see it is when the WSIB went into the unfunded liability quite a few years ago, and looking at that, that's really turned the tables for labor or for the workers big time, because now the premiums have dropped considerably over time once they met their unfunded liability. But during that time, what happened is more and more denials went through, and it became, as JP mentioned, very difficult to even get through the lines to talk to somebody, and even then to get a correct answer. So maybe the key is again, lobby to reverse and to put those payroll fines back up, or not payroll fines, but payroll costs on your WSIB. Now, unfortunately, with our employer, what they have done is on our pay stubs, they show what the WSIB cost is per pay. So every one of us, when we look at our pay stubs, we see how much money the company is putting out. And why is that? That's, again, to deter it. And it's not a fair system to do that for our workers. So again, it's a big problem, and it becomes lobbying again, is how do we lobby? We get exhausted, our resources are cut back, so again, it's probably coming back to the old school where we have to tie it back together, and possibly unions join back together and make the big fight.
Well, that's, go ahead.
I just want to speak to this because this was notorious in particularly in mining. What they would do in Elliott Lake, at least, and it was everywhere, is they would give bonuses for however many man hours free, accident work free. So you'd be working to the next bonus, the leather jacket and the TVs or whatever. And so what it did was it put pressure amongst the workers themselves, because you might have got injured, but as one guy put it to me, I was more afraid of my coworkers than I was of management reporting that, because I didn't want to be the guy to blow our safety record. We were at 999,000 work, and it was complete BS. What was happening was workers would get injured. The company would say, hey, we'll give you 100% of your wages, stay home, go on light duty, and light duty means we'll take you into the lunchroom, you can play cards for the day, you can maybe shred a few documents, and then they pay for your transportation back and forth to the site, and you don't report the injury. So you fall, break your leg, you hurt your back, and years later you're fighting, you re-injure it, or you have arthritis in your knee that you hurt or whatever, and WSIB looks at this and says, no, not happening. I'm starting to do filming of my miners to document and preserve for history what they went through. And I just did that with one who's dying right now of lung cancer. And he had a severe back injury, and the employer paid him to stay home for 2 months. And years later, when he had more problems with it, he applied to compensation, and he fought with them for 20 years. And he was very resentful because they wouldn't recognize it. He thought, yeah, they paid me to stay home, but they must have reported it. It was an accident. They didn't report it, and there was no evidence. There was no evidence of lost time. What do we have to compensate you for? And that kind of stuff went on everywhere, and it still goes on to some degree.
Eli?
Yeah, Ruben, I'm concerned because the fines, being as minimal as they are, is a license to commit murder. In our society, if you murder someone, you go to the can for 25 years. But we can kill them in the workplace, industrial diseases, you name it, accidental, not the proper equipment. And has anyone got any idea where the courts, when they started issuing these fines, thought it was a giveaway or something? I mean, murder is serious. And workers dying, I know those usually end up in the want ads. If you're looking to see where somebody got hurt or got killed, look in the want ads of a newspaper and you'll see it close to that. But we've given away the store, and what's the law? Maybe people who are more learned than I can tell me where the hell it started from that we were going to have a pittance for a fine for a person's life.
I don't know.
Let's be clear. When it's the The cost of doing business is workers' life, health and safety. That's what it is. It's their lives, it's their health. You can call it fines, you can call it whatever.
Incentive.
It is they are bearing the brunt of it in what,
Yeah, but
what they're
yeah,
living.
I don't want to
dying
compare it to cost of doing business. A worker's life is worth a hell of a lot more than $50,000 or $100,000. When we bail out the family and try to educate the kids who don't have income, it's society that pays for it all. And the people who are responsible for those deaths paid a pittance, a cost of doing business. No, I want to know why in our society we condemn murderers to 25 years in jail, but you can commit murder in the workplace and it's a pittance. Maybe some people say I'm a little wild by saying we commit murder. But you know, those industrial diseases, they knew in the sintering plant in Sudbury that 3 shifts now you got cancer. You know, we know, for example, asbestos and mesothelioma. One fiber can give it to you. And management knew. It's not as though they don't know and they don't have experts. They have experts. Far more than workers can ever afford to buy for protection. And it's time we got serious about sentencing because, well, we say it wouldn't stop it, but I'll tell you, if you thought you were going to the can for a year, you'd certainly clean up your workplace.
Steve?
You know, part of this does go back to the fact that there's historically always been this sense that corporations are nation builders and that they're too important to treat too seriously in these matters, that fear that people are going to lose their jobs. I think in many ways we find ourselves in that situation again. If you look at some of the ways that, if you look at the SNC-Lavalin scandal, for example, I mean, we very much are in a situation now where corporations have gained so much power that they're able to portray themselves in ways that we cannot imagine a world without them. I think also related to that is the fact that the way that we see violence in our society is extremely narrow, right? So we have that individualistic one-on-one form of violence that tends to dominate both politically, socially, culturally. That tends to be the way that we think about things. So when it comes to these kinds of incidents, they don't fit that narrative. They don't fit that characterization. When somebody's killed at the workplace, whether it is an incident that results in immediate death or a long-term injury or illness that results in death, we don't see those in the same light. So there are complex factors that I think continue to downplay the seriousness of these things, and those are the areas that we need to address for sure.
Thank you. Did you want to, Paul, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to raise, one thing that a lot of, it kind of arises from one of the things that Eli said. A lot of the discussion we've had was just around injuries and reporting injuries. But the equivalent when you have diseases that don't arise until decades later is that we have to have fines for overexposure and for knowingly overexposing people that are much more serious than, there's nothing done now, literally nothing done, except for, you've got to fix that. But if you knowingly overexpose people, that should also be treated as seriously because the repercussions they may not be immediate, but they're going to be down the line, and by then, those people who made those decisions to overexpose are not there. They're not going to suffer for their actions. It has to be now.
In fact, the injuries and fatalities are the tip of the iceberg. 90% of the iceberg is immersed in water, and the 90% would be what you're talking about, exposure to carcinogens and other.
Yeah, other types of hazards, really.
Yeah.
It's pretty broad.
Melody.
Yeah, I know you compared it to the parking tickets a while ago, JP, but just looking at that 90,000 to 150,000, if you think about it, that's 2 or 3 years of wages. That worker's life is worth a few years of their productivity. But the other thing that wasn't mentioned was the reality that some workplaces and some employers are so large that they get money back from the WSIB. Wonderful, you might have been fined, $50,000, $90,000 for a death, but that doesn't mean anything to you. That's not even a cost of business when you're getting $200,000 from the WSIB for your wonderful record, right? I mean, that's pretty mind-boggling. But it was really interesting what you said about putting a face to it. And I definitely agree with that in principle. Where I do disagree is the manager portion. As somebody who advocates for workers, I'll tell you managers are not necessarily the top of my list and people that I have great regard for, but that in a lot of ways that's another way of giving an employer another worker to throw under the bus. At the end of the day, that responsibility, the buck stops at the top. That's who should really be accountable, not managers. You know, it needs to be the CEO, it needs to be the executives that we put a face to, because they're the ones that are really accountable. I don't care if you haven't been in the workplace, I don't care if you haven't been in the country for years. You are still ultimately responsible for those conditions and what's prioritized. So.
Boards, yeah. Boards and CEOs are only happy to take credit when things are going well and take credit for the decisions that are made in that regard. But when things go bad, they're not willing to take those same take responsibility for it. So I think your point is extremely important.
Yeah.
And they shield themselves with they're numbered companies. You can't personally go after them. You go after the numbered company. Oh, well, we're bankrupt and too bad.
It's not an accident that there's no face to faceless corporations. Last question before we were going to break for questions, but we're there now. And I see some activists in the audience, so I'm going to open this up. Is there a place for advocacy? And if so, when should advocacy over profit be considered the responsibility of each and every occupational health and safety agency, board, and inspector?
If you have a fair and balanced system, you do not need advocacy. You're dealing with an oppressive system and you're dealing with vulnerable workers, you absolutely need advocacy.
Fair enough.
And it's human beings over profit. That's bottom line.
Well, I mean, in order to get past that, and in order to get past the helplessness, we have a room full of people, some of whom, maybe all of whom, are advocates. And we certainly have them up front. Even Paul suggested that he had a history as an advocate. So I'll ask the panel as well as the audience to think about it. I'll come to you. JP?
Well, we kind of brushed up on it and talked a little bit about the system, the Health and Safety Act and the compensation system. They give you just enough to keep you quiet. And that's by design. And it was mentioned a few times. It's just enough to get. The example that I used in Elliott Lake, where workers need to get out of their comfort zone. You need the passion and you need the ability to give everything up. Once you meet those criteria, then nothing's going to stop you. Mm-hmm. If you don't care about losing your job, you're going to stand up and refuse unsafe work. If you don't care about losing your job, you're going to picket and support other workers that are fighting the same battle. If you don't care about losing your job, you could accomplish a lot of things. But the fact is, we do care about our jobs. You know, I know you're fighting this, but I got to work, I got to get my 40 hours. So when people have enough, and they organize themselves to say, that's enough, we're stopping, remove yourself from labor. It's illegal. I'm not suggesting that we should, but that's the point where you really influence change. And Janice, I give credit, Janice did that. Mm-hmm. She got out of her comfort zone. That's it. I had enough. I'm taking this battle on. She had both got herself out of her comfort zone and had the passion to make change.
I'm going to ask you to expand on that phrase, remove yourself from labor, before the brothers and sisters come in.
Not from labor. What I mean...
Your work, your labor.
The comfort zone that I'm talking about, let's take an example of immigrants. I see there's people from Ireland that are tuned in, and the Italian folks, when they immigrated, they were outside their comfort zone. And to deal with that, what they did is they congregated, and Sudbury is a classic example of that. They congregated, they got together to be comfortable again. Mm-hmm. Once they were congregated, they started to make things happen. Okay? Right now, we're congregated, but we're happy. We're happy making $40 an hour, and I don't want to quit making $40 an hour, then you're going to start making changes. You know what I mean? So there's a couple of things that have to happen for real changes. The fact is we have it just good enough to not stand up and revolt. We're getting to a point where people are going to say, that's enough. We don't have it good enough anymore. And a revolt will happen. I don't know what that looks like, but it's starting to happen, and we see blips of that, in Canada today. Teachers are standing together. They're saying that's enough. What would be great is everybody go out on the picket line and support the teachers. It doesn't happen. We had PSWs that were holding the picket line for 5-6 months in the picket line. Yeah, beep, beep, that's my contribution to that. You know what I mean? It's not enough. You have to get yourself out and freeze your ass on the picket line with them to make a difference. And 1,000 people should. So we gotta rethink how solidarity looks like. It's easy to say that you're my brother. At what cost?
There are more of us than there are of them. There are more of us than there are of them, and we have more in common than those few that hold power. And when we stand together, we can make a change. And it's hard, because it's hard when you see, well, this guy over here got this and this guy, you know, and we fight amongst ourselves and between unions and stuff like that. We have more in common than we do apart. And when we stand together and when we support each other as best as we can, and I know it's easy to burn out, but we do our best, and we move that forward, and we float that forward, and we can do it.
Steve, any comment?
No, I think this solidarity question is the big one that's looming, that there needs to be more of that for us to be able to push things forward. And I agree with JP. There's a favorite Lily Tomlin quote that I have, that things are going to get a lot worse before they get worse. And I think we're kind of approaching some of that point on some levels, and the teachers are a great example. I think there's an understanding. People are pushed in the workplace more and more to do more with less, to get paid less to do more. And when people can't make ends meet, there has to be a limit to this. And I think that some of the collective acknowledgement of that situation is starting to emerge.
Thank you all. I'm going to throw it out to the audience. I have a question back there.
It's not exactly a question, but it's
Or a
just,
comment. Feel free to comment,
it's a little
folks.
bit of advocacy that we can all do without having to rely on a union if we're not in a unionized environment. Teach your children. Start at home. Occupational health and safety should be something that becomes a dinner table conversation. You don't have to do things where you're going to get hurt. Move your educators to put it into a school course, part of the curriculum, so that children are prepared before they even go into a workforce or a workplace and have to face the pressures of feeding their families. It will be so ingrained into us as a society if we start young, rather than trying to correct the problem at the other end.
Very good.
Sorry, what you both said just kind of triggered something in me. I remember Charlie Angus posted something about, it was when they were trying to organize, I believe it was in Timmins, and you know, the employers had a lot of power, and they were union busting as best as they can. And when they were trying to organize, and they threatened them all, and they were sending in, the government sent in police and stuff and the women and the children went out. The guys went to work, and the women and the children went out. Their wives and their kids, and the police were not going to be busting their heads with night batons. And I think some of what my McIntyre Potter miners, you know, there are some of them who are still working, but many of them are retired, many of them are deceased. But they get to that point where, you know, and maybe their company folded and they didn't get a pension, so they're not worried about losing their pensions, and they have little to lose to stand up. And it's hard for somebody, as JP says, to leave a job, to risk losing that job, because that's, you know, going to keep your family together and that sort of thing. So maybe the rest of us, you know, daughters and sons and people who can stand up, and that's why my guys are saying, I need to change things for my grandkids. And it's like, when you look at studies of abusive people in abusive relationships, they'll take so much abuse, but then as soon as you start on their kids, that's when they have the courage to leave. And when you start on your brothers and your sisters and the rest of us stand up, that's going to stop the abuser, that's going to stop the bullying. And we can do that for each other, and we should. We must.
Any comments or questions? Yep.
Yeah, and I agree with JP. You look, we talk a lot about the mines, and one of the things that I see, and as a worker rep, I'll tell you, time in and time out, I have workers come in to my office and are discontent about something, and they say, well, you know, that's got to be dealt with, and we got to deal with this. And but by the way, when I leave the office, don't use my name. Keep me out of it. It's like now your job to take care of this. So, you know, automatically you see and understand the fear factor. And, you know, I look at the way the laws have changed. You go back in the day when there was sit-downs in the workplace. Things were gone bad. Yeah, okay, buddy, that's it. Lay down your tools, guys. Nothing is going to happen. But now we live also in the economy, I find, that guys get paid probably more bonus than wages in the mining industry today. And everybody wants the big pay, big whatever, and they turn a blind eye and get it done. So that's another issue. We got to look at the laws. And we talk about mining, but you know what? My daughter gave me a call about a year and a half ago. And while she was studying for her RN, she was working part-time as a PSW, and she was forced to work more than 8 hours. And got to the point at 12 hours, she says, Dad, I'm too tired. I said, I'm going to make a mistake. I can't be here anymore. But there was no other PSWs to go into that workplace. And they were forced to stay another 2 or 3 hours. So the laws have to change. We have to get back. We got to lobby. And you know what? That was a year and a half ago. That problem hasn't disappeared. It's even worse today. We are so short of PSWs that, you know what? Our grandparents, our mom and dads that are in these healthcare centers, it's disgusting. So until that, I don't know what it's going to take, guys. If it affects you personally and it happens to you, and then maybe the light's going to come on, I don't know. But I totally agree, and I'm glad we had this day to share, because we got to take it back. We got to bring it back to the members. We got to talk around the supper table, and we got to make this message, put it out front and center. And we got lots of lobbying to do. And to the panel, thank you. It was a great afternoon.
Thank you for that. Anyone else? Comments? One over here.
Brittany over here.
Thank you very much. It's a very good discussions. I had a chance, I was actually privileged to work many mining organizations, and I'd like to make a couple of comments. IRS exists in a unionized environment. I work also with many organizations and companies where it's non-unionized. We tend to always focus on a unionized people, but I tell you that there is non-existing IRS with a non-unionized workforces, and most of the people are non-unionized, and you have all these conditions, and I'm gonna say that the third world country situations I see nowadays with the non-unionized workers, and people are scared to speak up about their health and safety, and they don't even know what avenue they could take to get some advice. So that's something I think we cannot forget, that since we're talking, you know, most of us, I think from many of you guys are involved with unions, but majority of the people are actually not unionized, and their conditions, I'm gonna say that, 10 times worse than right now a unionized employee, because at least the union is somewhat there to protect them and back them up about rules and regulations and internal. So that's one comment that I think we need to somehow find a solution for the other group of people who has absolutely no support out there or avenue to help them with their problems. And the IRS, a very good example, you know, about, you guys talk about those, you know, little bonus cards, you know, about reporting injuries and things like that. all the 3 or 4 mines I worked, exactly what it is, you know. I'm not reporting, you know, I tripped over and I got bruised or pulled, you know, muscles, because my coworker's not gonna be happy that losing the $100 gas ticket this month for paying for the gas coming into work. So it's really faulty, and we're setting people up for failure that way to report injuries. And I think it's more common than people actually realize that how much injuries are not reported, and it's just talked about between workers and unions and between people, but it's actually more prevalent. So that's all. That's my comment. Thank you.
Anyone else? Over there? Did I see a hand? No. Anybody from the webinar? Well, here's our last chance to wrap up. I have to thank all my panelists, all 5 of you, Bob, Steve, JP, Janice, and Paul. I have to thank an attentive and engaged audience. I've written down some of the suggestions, and it's a familiar list, but let me just read a few of these. Legislation and regulation, education, advocacy, direct action, get to the youth, probably through schools, leave your comfort zone, communicate with your members, lobby, report all unsafe working conditions, whether it's a chemical, you know, physical injury or hazard, rather. And I'm sure that I could have gone on, but I'm not going to try your patience any further. Dr. Bob, you have your last chance to say something to folks before you go. Nothing? Then have a good day, and thank you all very much. I'm going to turn it over to Dave, who's going to say some final words to you. The panel thanks you.
So thanks, Ruben, and all the members of our local advisory committee who put together this afternoon's presentation. It was great. Thanks to all the panelists and everybody who came in today and everybody participating online in the webinar. And please, before you go, if you could fill out the feedback form and leave it for us. It helps us to plan future events. And everybody online is also going to get one by email. Please return it to us. And thanks to all the staff who made it possible. And thanks for coming. Bye-bye.
Well done. Really well done. You two were amazing. The academic shipmates were great. You two.
It was very nice to see you. Have a safe trip back.
Nice to see you. Thank you. Take care.
I love being on this panel. Like, because